2,814 meters up, on the summit of Mount Hermon, there is a roofless rectangle of cut stone. In 1869, a British explorer found a limestone slab inside it, broke it in two, and carried it down the mountain. It sits in the British Museum. The inscription concerns an oath. And an excluded book, the Book of Enoch, says this mountain is where the Watchers swore one. Copies of that book were pulled from a desert cave in Aramaic. Officials call it myth. But the mountain is real, and what Enoch says next has no address. Start with the mountain, because the mountain is the part nobody can argue with. Hermon is not a symbol. It is a mass of limestone straddling Syria, Lebanon, and the Golan, snow-capped for most of the year, visible from 100 kilometers away. Its highest point is 2,814 meters. And near that highest point sits the structure the sources call Qasr Antar, the highest known ancient place of worship anywhere in the world. Not a temple in a valley, not a shrine on a hillside. A cult site built at 9,000 feet where the air is thin and the wind never stops. Sir Charles Warren went up in 1869. He described what he found as a rectangular building with no roof, sitting on an oval stone platform. Inside, he located a limestone stele, a slab roughly 4 feet high, 18 inches wide, a foot thick. He broke it into two pieces to get it off the mountain. Those pieces are in London now in the British Museum, catalogued and lit and behind glass. 8 worn lines of Greek across the face. And here is where this stops being a normal archaeological story. The inscription is about an oath. The British Museum's own description calls it a warning. You do not enter the temple of Baal Hermon without taking the required oath. That is the object. That is what it says it is. Now open a book that almost nobody's Bible contains. The Book of Enoch, chapter 6. It describes a group of heavenly beings who look down at human women, decide to descend, and then hesitate. Their leader tells them he is afraid he will be left alone to carry the punishment. So they do something specific. They bind themselves to each other with a mutual oath and a curse, all of them, so that none can back out. And the text names the place. They come down on the summit of Mount Hermon. Not a high place, not a mountain in the east, not a symbol of pride. That mountain, the one with the height, the one with the ruin, the one with a broken slab in London that talks about oath takers. You could call that a coincidence, and plenty of serious people do. Hold on to that thought. I'm going to come back to it, and I'm going to give you the strongest version of the objection, because it's a real one. But first you need to understand why this text exists at all, and why almost every church in the world quietly walked away from it. The Book of Enoch is not in your Bible. It was excluded from the Jewish canon, excluded from the Catholic canon, excluded from the Protestant canon. It survives complete in exactly one tradition, Ethiopic, the ancient language of the Ethiopian church which kept it as scripture when everyone else let it go. Beyond that, Greek pieces, and beyond that, torn strips of Aramaic. But it did not vanish. It was quoted in the New Testament, in the letter of Jude, by name, as prophecy. Whatever else it is, this was not fringe reading material in the first century. This was a book people took seriously enough to argue about. And the reason it makes people uncomfortable is not the oath on the mountain. It's chapter 15. Here's the setup. The Watchers come down, they take wives, they teach humanity things they were not supposed to teach. Metalworking, weapons, cosmetics, sorcery, the reading of signs. And they father children. Hybrid children. Giants. The text is blunt about the result. The giants consume everything the humans produce, then turn on the humans themselves, then turn on each other. So heaven responds. And this is the part where the text starts behaving very strangely. Chapter 10 is a set of orders. Archangels are dispatched by name, each with a task. And the punishments are not vague. One of the leaders is to be bound hand and foot and cast into darkness. A hole is opened in the desert. He is thrown in, covered, buried under rough and jagged rocks. The others are bound in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations until the day of judgment, when they go to the fire forever. Read that again and notice what it is. Bind, cast, open, cover, confine. Those are not adjectives. Those are verbs with hands attached. Somebody is doing something to somebody in a location with rocks and a hole and a covering. The text is not describing a spiritual condition. It's describing an operation. So the Watchers get a prison. The text builds it, staffs it, seals it, and sets a duration on it. Then it gets to the giants. And it does not use the prison. Chapter 15 is presented as direct speech. The Watchers have petitioned for mercy and been refused, and the answer explains why. You were spirits, it says, immortal, living forever, and for that reason I never appointed wives for you, because the dwelling of spiritual beings is in heaven. But you came down and you produced flesh through blood, and the children of that union are not what you are and not what humans are. Then comes the line. The giants, born from spirit and flesh, will be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth will be their dwelling. Evil spirits came out from their bodies, because they were born from humans, and from the holy Watchers is their origin and first foundation. They will be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits they will be called. Stop on the word dwelling. A dwelling is a place. It is where something lives. This is not a poetic flourish. It's a jurisdiction. The passage has already established that the spirits of heaven dwell in heaven. Now it establishes the counterpart. The spirits born on the earth dwell on the earth. That is the ruling. That is the entire logic of the sentence. And that means the fathers were sealed under rocks in a hole in the desert. The sons were released onto the surface of the world with no sentence, no seal, and no expiry date. That is not how a metaphor usually distributes its punishments. A metaphor that has just gone to the trouble of building a prison uses the prison. It gets worse when you keep reading, because chapter 15 then describes their behavior, and it reads like a case file entry, not like theology. They afflict, they oppress, they destroy, they attack, they do battle, they work destruction on the earth and cause trouble. And then this. They take no food, but nevertheless they hunger, and they thirst. Sit with that one. It's the detail that stops people cold. The text is not saying they eat, it is saying they cannot eat, and are hungry anyway. It has invented, or recorded, a specific pathological condition. An appetite that exists without a body to satisfy it. That is not a symbol of sin. That is a description of a state offered with the flat confidence of somebody who thinks he is explaining a mechanism. Then the final clause. These spirits will rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they came from them. They target humanity specifically because they are half human. The passage gives a motive. It gives an origin. It gives a category, a jurisdiction, an appetite, and a behavior profile. That is a classification document. The mainstream reading of all this is straightforward, and I'm not going to strawman it. Scholars read chapter 15 as etiology, an origin story invented after the fact to explain something people already believed. Ancient Jews in the Second Temple period believed the world was full of hostile spirits. Enoch supplies a genealogy for them. The Watchers' material also borrows visibly from older Mesopotamian traditions about divine beings and forbidden knowledge. Under this reading, nobody saw anything. Somebody built an explanation. Fine. That reading works. Until you look at where these words physically were. For most of history, the Book of Enoch reached the West through Ethiopia, which meant it was easy to treat it as a late curiosity. A book of legends filtered through centuries of translation, drifting further from anything real with every copy. Then they opened the caves. Qumran, the cliffs above the Dead Sea, riddled with holes and pale rock. Cave 4 is the famous one, a hollow gouged into a marl spur, and the single richest deposit of the entire find. Bedouin reached it first in 1952. Excavators followed the same year. What came out was not scrolls. It was wreckage. Tens of thousands of fragments, most of them the size of a fingernail. And among that wreckage were copies of Enoch. In Aramaic, the original language. They're cataloged now with numbers instead of names. 4Q201, 4Q202, 4Q204 through 4Q207, 4Q212. The oldest of them, 4Q201, has been dated by handwriting to somewhere around 200 to 150 BCE by its first editor, and pushed slightly earlier, roughly 225 to 175 by its most recent one. Scholars argue about the exact decade. Nobody argues about the era. That means the Watcher's narrative was already old, already circulating, already being copied by trained scribes before the New Testament existed, before the Roman occupation of Judea. This is not a medieval invention. This is not Ethiopian embroidery. The fathers of the story were being read in the desert 2 centuries before Christ. But here's the detail that matters most, and it's the one that almost never gets said out loud. The Cave 4 fragments don't just cover the popular parts. Manuscript 4Q204 preserves material corresponding to chapters 12 through 15. Chapter 15. The demon passage, the dwelling, the hunger. It is not a late addition, not a Christian interpolation, not something a monk added 1,000 years later. It was there in Aramaic, in the desert, in that library, on leather before the Common Era. And that raises a question the etiology reading has to answer, because in the same collection of caves, in the same community's texts, somebody was not treating this as folklore. Somebody was treating it as an operational threat. The manuscripts catalogued 4Q510 and 4Q511 are known as the Songs of the Sage. 2 copies of the same composition dated by handwriting to the late 1st century BCE. And what they contain is not doctrine, it's a liturgy. The community's instructor recites the glory of God for a stated purpose, to frighten and terrify a list of specific entities. The list names spirits of the destroying angels, it names demons, it names Lilith, it names howlers, and it names, in Hebrew, the spirits of the bastards. Bastards! Illegitimate offspring. Beings born from a union that should never have happened. Now, scholars disagree about whether that term points directly at the giant spirits from Enoch. And I want to be honest that the identification is argued rather than settled. But look at what is not in dispute. Somebody at Qumran wrote a text whose stated job was to terrify a category of spirit defined by illegitimate birth. They copied it twice. They kept it with their copies of Enoch. And 4Q511 survives in over 200 fragments, which tells you it was used. Whatever they believed, they were not writing an essay about it. They were reciting against it. And a second book from the same period gives the thing a number. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 10. After the flood, the demons are back at work, and Noah prays for them to be locked away. The order goes out to bind all of them. And then the chief of the spirits, Mastema, negotiates. "Leave some of them with me," he says, "or I cannot carry out my will against humanity." The answer? Let 1/10 part of them remain. Let 9 parts descend into the place of condemnation. 9/10 locked, 1/10 left loose on the surface. Read that as literature, and it's a strange thing to write. Because Enoch had already released all of them, with no limit at all. Jubilees is arguing with it. Jubilees is imposing a quota. And you do not negotiate a percentage about a metaphor. You negotiate a percentage about a population. 2 texts, roughly the same century, disagreeing about how many are still out there. Now let's go back to the mountain, because there is a problem waiting there, and it is a problem of exactly 1 letter. That stela Warren carried down. The Greek on it has been read more than one way, and the difference is not cosmetic. George Nicholsburg, one of the most important scholars of Enoch who ever lived, rendered it as, "According to the command of the greatest and holy God, those who take an oath proceed from here." Under that reading, this is a marker for a group defined by an oath, on the mountain Enoch names as the Mountain of the Oath. Nicholsburg connected the two directly. The British Museum reading includes a negative, "Those who do not take the oath." Under that reading, it is a routine warning sign. Swear the required oath before you enter or stay out. 1 Greek particle, 2 completely different stones. One is a memorial to oath takers, the other is a no-entry notice for tourists. And this is where I have to hand you the strongest objection against the whole connection, because it's real and it's serious. The inscription is Greek, not Aramaic or Hebrew or Canaanite. It is generally dated to somewhere around the 3rd century of the Common Era, possibly later, centuries after Enoch was written. It names no deity. It names no watchers. It names no semjaza. Several scholars say plainly that the link to Enoch is unfounded, and that oaths were ordinary in ancient cult sites everywhere. So, no, the stele does not prove the watchers. Nothing I've shown you proves the watchers. If you want the clean version, here it is. An ancient community told a story about a mountain. A later cult used the same mountain, and both involved oaths because mountains and oaths were both common. That explanation is available. It is also strangely thin at the edges, because it does not touch chapter 15 at all. The stele is a coincidence you can dismiss. The dwelling clause is a sentence in a manuscript, sitting in a climate-controlled room in Jerusalem, written in Aramaic before the Roman Empire reached Judea, that assigns a category of being to the surface of the earth and gives it a permanent hunger. No inscription is required for that. No mountain is required for that. It just sits there, in ink, unchanged, saying what it has always said. And it says the same thing in every version we have. This is the part that unsettles textual scholars more than anything else. The Aramaic is fragmentary. That's the nature of the material, thousands of pieces from a cave, most of them ruined. But where we can compare Aramaic against Greek against Ethiopic, the demonology holds. Nobody softened it. Nobody quietly edited the giants into a symbol. The passage was excluded from canon, but it was never corrected. What changed was us. The text stayed still, and the interpretation moved around it. Now here is the last piece, and it's the one I keep coming back to. If you wanted to settle the mountain question, properly survey Khazar Antar, examine what else is up there, map the summit cult sites in detail, you can't. The summit of Hermon has been a military problem for over half a century. Its peak is divided between Lebanon, Syria, and the Israeli-held Golan, and the highest permanently staffed United Nations position anywhere in the world sat on it. In December 2024, after the fall of the Assad regime, Israeli forces moved into the demilitarized buffer zone and onto the Syrian side of the summit. Officials stated publicly that the presence would continue indefinitely. New outposts went up. New routes were cut to the peak. Construction material was hauled to the top. There is no cover-up here, and I'm not going to invent one. Nobody has been denied a permit that I can point to. Nobody has been silenced. It's simpler and colder than that. The most famous mountain in the fallen angel tradition, the one place named by a book that was pushed out of every major canon, is currently a fortified military position that civilians cannot walk onto. The evidence is not hidden. It is just standing behind a line, in the snow, with a radio antenna next to it. So take the whole file and lay it on the table at once. A named mountain with a measurable height and a roofless stone rectangle at the top of it. A broken stele in London whose central word is an oath and whose meaning turns on a single disputed letter. A book quoted in the New Testament and excluded from nearly every canon. Aramaic copies of that book pulled out of Cave 4, older than the Gospels, including the chapters that matter most. A liturgy from the same caves written to terrify a class of spirits defined by illegitimate birth. A second ancient book fixing the number of survivors at 1 in 10. And a judgment scene that builds a prison in the desert, buries the fathers under jagged rocks for 70 generations, and then hands the sons the surface of the world. Any one of those is a metaphor. Two are a coincidence. But when a text gives you a named location, physical verbs, a sealed prison, a jurisdiction, a population, an appetite, and a copy in the original language from a cave in the Judean desert, the symbolic reading stops being an answer and starts being a preference. I am not telling you there are spirits walking around out there. I can't tell you that, and neither can anyone else. What I'm telling you is that the ancient writer did not sound like a man building an allegory. He sounded like a man filing a report on something he thought had already been decided, in a place he could point to, about beings he thought were still here. The mountain is still 2,814 meters high. The roofless rectangle is still up there in the snow, with soldiers around it now instead of pilgrims. The steel is still in two pieces behind glass in London, still arguing about one letter. The Aramaic is still in fragments under climate control in Jerusalem. And the sentence has never been edited, in any language, in any manuscript, in any tradition that preserved it. The giants, born from spirit and flesh, will be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth will be their dwelling.